On May 4th, 1912, a small local newspaper in Wisconsin published a short article that, by today's standards, would trigger a worldwide media frenzy within hours. Local excavators, digging into an ancient burial mound near Lake Delavan, reported unearthing an entire cemetery of skeletons, every single one measuring between 7 and 10 feet tall. The article described skulls with unusually prominent brow ridges, double rows of teeth, and elongated skulls unlike anything in the local population, buried in an organized, ceremonial pattern that suggested a genuine, extinct community, not a single anomaly. The newspaper reported the story matter-of-factly, almost casually, the way you'd report a new bridge being built. And then, like hundreds of nearly identical stories printed in newspapers across the world over the following decades, the trail simply goes cold. No museum holds the remains. No official scientific report was ever published, confirming or denying the find. The bones, along with the story itself, effectively vanished. If this were a single, isolated incident, it would be easy to dismiss. A local paper stretching the truth for readers. A mistaken identification. A story that grew more dramatic with each retelling. But this Wisconsin case isn't isolated at all. It's one of literally hundreds of remarkably similar newspaper reports published across the United States, Europe, and beyond throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, each describing the discovery of unusually large human skeletal remains, often accompanied by specific measurements, detailed physical descriptions, and named witnesses. And almost without exception, every single one of these discoveries shares the exact same ending. The remains disappear from any further scientific or public record almost immediately after being reported. Before understanding why these reports matter, and why so many people find their disappearance suspicious, it helps to understand just how deep the idea of giants runs through human storytelling, across cultures that had no possible contact with each other. In Hebrew tradition, the book of Genesis describes the Nephilim, a race of giants born from the union of divine beings and human women. Their existence treated within the text as historical fact, rather than metaphor. In Greek mythology, the Titans and later the giants themselves waged literal wars against the Olympian gods, described with specific genealogies and physical characteristics, rather than vague, symbolic language. Norse mythology describes the Jotnar, an entire race of giant beings woven directly into the fundamental cosmology of Norse belief, present at both the creation and the eventual destruction of the world. And across numerous Native American oral traditions, from the Paiute stories of red-haired giants in Nevada to Iroquois legends of the Stonish giants, similar accounts of unusually tall, physically distinct beings appear again and again, often described with specific and consistent physical details, across tribes separated by enormous geographic distances. This pattern, giant beings appearing independently across cultures with no historical contact, doesn't prove giants were real in a literal sense. Comparative mythologists have long noted that certain archetypal story elements, including giants, tend to emerge independently across unrelated cultures simply because they reflect universal human psychology. Fear of the unknown, respect for ancestors imagined as larger than life, or simply the natural human tendency to exaggerate. But it does mean that when actual physical evidence, real newspaper reports of real excavated bones, started appearing across America specifically during a period when westward expansion was uncovering thousands of previously undisturbed ancient burial sites, it landed on a culture already deeply primed, through religious text and folklore, to take the possibility of giants seriously. The sheer volume of these newspaper accounts is what makes this case genuinely different from most isolated cryptid or ancient mystery reports. Researchers who have compiled archives of these articles count literally hundreds of separate reports, spanning from the early 1800s through the 1930s, describing giant skeletal remains found in burial mounds across Ohio, Illinois, West Virginia, and dozens of other states, as well as similar reports from various sites across Europe. The specificity of many of these reports is what makes them difficult to dismiss entirely as simple fabrication. Several describe named excavators, specific measurements taken with actual tools, and in some cases photographs, several of which still circulate today, showing excavation sites with unusually large bones laid out for documentation, though the authenticity and scale accuracy of these specific photographs remains a subject of genuine ongoing debate among researchers. Which brings us to the central, uncomfortable question that keeps this particular mystery alive far longer than most similar stories. If even a small fraction of these hundreds of reports describe genuine, unusually large human remains, where did all of that physical evidence actually go? The most widely circulated explanation among believers centers specifically on the Smithsonian Institution, America's most prominent scientific and historical research body, and involves an accusation that the organization deliberately suppressed and destroyed evidence of giant skeletal remains throughout the early 20th century, specifically to protect a particular academic theory about human evolution and migration that giant remains would have seriously complicated. Believers point to a genuinely documented practice within the Smithsonian during this era, one confirmed by internal institutional records that later came to light, of destroying or discarding skeletal remains deemed scientifically unimportant. A standard, if now widely criticized, practice across many archaeological institutions of that period, driven largely by simple storage limitations rather than any coordinated conspiracy. Believers argue that unusually large remains specifically were quietly folded into this general practice of destruction, deliberately buried within a broader, more mundane pattern of remains disposal precisely because they didn't fit accepted scientific models of the time. Mainstream historians and anthropologists offer a considerably less dramatic, though still genuinely uncomfortable, explanation for why so much of this evidence never survived to be properly examined. Early American archaeology, particularly in the 1800s, was conducted almost entirely without the rigorous documentation standards, careful measurement protocols, or long-term preservation practices that define professional archaeology today. Many of these excavations weren't carried out by trained scientists at all, but by amateur collectors, local landowners, or newspaper reporters eager for a dramatic story, working with minimal equipment and even less scientific rigor. Under this explanation, many reported measurements were likely simply wrong. Honest mistakes made by untrained excavators, measuring poorly preserved, fragmented remains, sometimes further distorted by the natural expansion and warping that occurs when bone is buried, and later disturbed. Genuine skeletal remains, once removed from burial sites without proper preservation techniques, frequently deteriorated rapidly upon exposure to air, crumbling within weeks or months, an entirely mundane, tragic loss of scientific evidence rather than a deliberate cover-up. There's also a documented history of deliberate, straightforward fraud connected to several of the era's most famous giant skeleton reports, motivated not by any grand institutional conspiracy, but by simple, old-fashioned financial opportunism. Several confirmed hoaxes from this exact period, including elaborately staged fake giant remains created specifically to attract paying visitors to roadside attractions and traveling exhibitions, are well documented, proving that at least some percentage of these historical reports were, without question, deliberate fabrications designed to profit from exactly the same widespread cultural fascination with giants that makes this topic so compelling today. And finally, a genuinely mundane explanation accounts for a significant number of these historical reports entirely: misidentification, remains from extinct megafauna, particularly mastodon and mammoth bones, which were being discovered with genuine regularity throughout this same period across North America, share certain superficial similarities to oversized human remains when examined by untrained observers working without modern comparative anatomical knowledge. Several documented giant skeleton reports from this era were later definitively identified, upon closer examination by trained scientists, as misidentified animal remains rather than anything human at all. So where does that leave the hundreds of remaining reports that don't fit neatly into fraud, misidentification, or simple poor documentation? Honestly, in a genuinely uncomfortable historical gray area that neither side of this debate can fully close. Believers are correct that the sheer documented volume and specificity of these reports is difficult to fully explain through fraud and error alone. Skeptics are correct that not a single verified, properly preserved, scientifically examined giant human skeleton has ever been produced and made available for modern examination, despite over a century of specific claims that such remains once existed in significant numbers. Both of these facts are simultaneously true, and that persistent, unresolved tension is exactly why this particular mystery has refused to fade the way most historical curiosities eventually do. What we're left with is a mountain of historical documentation and almost no physical evidence to settle the question either way. Whether that's the tragic result of poor 19th century archaeology, deliberate suppression, or just a fading fascination the camera, eventually made harder to fake, remains over a century later, a question the evidence itself is no longer here to answer.